Hi there, it's Chantal from Fresh is Real. So in today's video, we're going to talk about maintaining and caring for a gluten-free sourdough starter. In part one, I quickly showed you how easy it is to mix flour and water to let it ferment and create cultured yeast. But in this video, I'm going to answer some common questions about how to store, how to feed, and how to care for your gluten-free sourdough starter. So one of the first questions I'm going to answer is how and or where do you store your starter once it's ready? I keep mine in the refrigerator. As an example, this is a starter that's probably almost ready to use. Once I would use, let's say, up to 1 cup in a recipe, then, if there's this much left in a jar, I would probably just cover it. You might wonder if you can store your starter on the counter. The answer in part is yes, you could, but if you were to do that, you would have to use it quite frequently because it would keep growing as you keep feeding it. And if you didn't feed it, it would go flat. The reason you put it in the refrigerator is to slow down the fermentation process until you are ready to make with it again. So for now, once you've used your starter and there's enough left in the jar, let's say 1 cup, just cover it, secure it with an elastic band, put it in the refrigerator. Then the next question to follow would be how do I go about feeding my starter once I am ready to bake a loaf? So the best way to explain this this is an example of a starter I just removed from the fridge this morning. And there's a little bit of an accumulation of water on top. Some refer to this as hooch. I tend to pour it out. Pouring it out for me means that as I feed it more flour and fresh water, it creates a less sourdough. But if you like the sourness, then by all means, you could just stir it back in. That's fine too. So this is the starter I took out this morning, and if you want, I can actually even demonstrate. I would take this out. I am just going to pour out the liquid that's on top. This particular starter is the starter I refer to as my fruity starter because when I first made it, I probably had apples or grapes or something in it to help the fermentation, and it just always kept a sweeter aroma than the other starters I have. So I quite like this one. My next step would be to feed it a little bit of flour. So this one is a brown rice starter, which is a great starter to start with if you've never made a starter before. So I'm just gonna feed it 1/4 cup. Some people might feed it up to 1/2 cup. So I'll do 1/4 cup of flour, and then I will do 1/4 cup of water. The water I use is spring water most often. Sometimes I might use filtered water. I never use tap or chlorinated water. That was a fruit fly. Fruit flies love starters. If you have them, it's hard to get rid of them, but anyhow. And then I would just stir it. Stirring it will just distribute the fresh food amongst the starter that's already been in your jar. As you might be able to see or may not be able to see, my jars kind of gross after a while, so I do sometimes transfer my starters to a clean jar and kind of take it from there. When I'm stirring a gluten-free starter, it kind of like a thick pancake batter. If it's too liquidy, just add a little bit more flour. You want a little bit of resistance, but you don't want it to be too liquidy. So once it's mixed, you can just use the same cover it had, secure it with an elastic band. So this would be on the counter for 2 to 4 hours until it gets to be bubbly and happy again. And then at that point, you could use it for bread to bake or to mix your ingredients. My next question is, do I need to discard any of the starter before or after feeding it? Well, as you just saw, I did not get rid of any of the starter. I just poured out the hooch. Once my starter is established and happy and active, I truthfully never discard. I always try to maintain a certain amount in my jar so I don't have to discard. This is not a wheat starter and it won't grow as much as a wheat starter. So quite frankly, I don't feel there's a need to discard any. So if you look at the one I just mixed, it will grow a little bit in size, but it won't, most likely won't overflow because I always keep it to less than half. And I'm probably going to use up to 1 cup in a recipe, so then I'll be left with a safe amount to return to the fridge until I'm ready to bake again. How often should I feed my gluten-free sourdough starter once refrigerated? I try to feed mine once a week if I remember to feed them that often. But I've had mine, some of mine have gone like up to 3 weeks without feeding, and they've been fine. All that happens is that it kind of gets kind of drier and compact, and then you just have to take it out, bring it back to room temperature, feed it water and flour, stir it, and hopefully it's fine. If you've forgot about your starter for 2 months, then it might be kind of hard to salvage, but if it's not moldy and it still smells good, you could just try to scoop out a little bit of it, put it in a new jar, and then feed it more fresh flour and water and see if that can help make it happy again. How much should I keep in a jar in order to keep my starter alive? I've kind of already covered that question before, but again, usually a cup or so in a jar while it's in the fridge is safe, a good amount to keep. Can I feed my starter a different gluten-free flour? Well, I thought of this question ahead of time, and I know it's been asked in online forums and such, but yes, I don't see why you cannot feed, let's say, a starter that was initially prepared with brown rice flour with a different flour. Yesterday, I took some of the brown rice flour and I added buckwheat to it, but as you can see, it creates a completely different colored starter, but that's fine. It just adds or introduces different types of bacteria. It is quite fine to add a different flour to a starter that was perhaps started as just brown rice. Just to show you too is that some buckwheat flours are actually kind of darker in color. So if you want to bake a loaf that's dark as something like this, then yes, adding or using buckwheat would create such a loaf. And you know what? Experiment. There's no rules to this sourdough starter game. You can do whatever you want once you have your starter. Asking, if I have to go away for a long period of time, what should I do with my starter? Well, you can feed it a good feeding before you leave. And if you plan on being gone for more than 3 weeks, then you could ask somebody to feed it for you. But in all honesty, if you're just gone for a week or 2, I would not worry about it. You just feed it before you leave, mix it up, put it back in the fridge, and it should be fine. And then don't forget to feed it when you come back too. If my starter gets moldy, what do I do? This happens a lot. Sometimes it's from maybe using a tool that wasn't really clean, or something in the air just went into your starter. Some people do try to scoop it out and salvage their existing starter, or some will scoop it out and then take some of that starter and place it in a new jar. But I think it's up to you to decide if you want to experiment with that. Personally, I would probably just discard it, or just get rid of it and not use it. I do have backups. I have a few starters in my fridge, so I wouldn't worry too much about it, but I just try to prevent mold if you can, by using clean jars, clean tools. I usually use chopsticks to stir or a wooden spoon. Sometimes I'll use a regular spoon just to scoop out the flour that I put into my jar, but I don't tend to mix with the regular spoons. Some people say that metal or stainless steel, I don't know which one's which. I know which one's which, but I don't know which one can actually potentially kill some bacteria in your starter. So try to just use a chopstick or a wooden spoon or something to stir. if I wanted to share some starter with a friend, how would I go about doing so? Well, you could just take a smaller jar and take some of your starter and then give it a good feeding, like 1/4 cup of flour with 1/4 cup of water, and stir it. Maybe do that a couple times, and once it's active and bubbly, well, then you could share it with somebody that would like to try to make sourdough bread. Do I have any last tips and tricks? Well, fermentation is a beast of its own. So if you ferment a lot, like I do, sometimes my kitchen is known to be a bit of a fermentation land. Try to maybe separate your gluten-free sourdough starters from, let's say, a kombucha or kimchi or sauerkraut or something like that, just because sometimes some people think that it's very possible for those bacteria to kind of make their way into your starters. If it's kombucha, it might not be a bad thing, but I know for a fact one time I had either apples beside a starter or near my starter. I had applesauce or something, but I swear to God, my starter smelled so fruity and almost like apples. So I think there's some truth to that if you're trying to cultivate wild yeast around other things that might have yeast, that it's possible that it could be beneficial, but at the same time, maybe it could add, I don't know, different types of yeast you may not want in a starter. So just be mindful to place it maybe away from everything else in your kitchen. And if you're concerned, you can always put a tea towel over your jar, especially if your kitchen is like very sunny or very hot. If it's too hot, then you might want to put your jar in a different room. If it's wintertime and it's too cold, you might want to find the warmest spot in your house, just because sometimes warmth will make your starter kind of get bubbly faster. Somebody had asked if I don't like my bread to be sour, or if you want it to be more sour, what do you do? I kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier, is the hooch that forms on the starter while it's in the fridge. If you like a sour loaf, just keep it. If you don't like it sour, I would pour it out. But also in the initial stages of preparing a sourdough starter, I forget if it's like day 4 and 5, but at that point there's hooch or liquid that collects at the top. If you want your sourdough starter to be really sour, you can just keep that. But when I'm first creating a starter, I always pour it out because it creates a more, like a sweeter starter, which I personally like. You use freshly milled grains, it'll work really well. If you use organic flour, that is also very helpful. If you have a starter that just doesn't seem to get too bubbly or active when you're trying to feed it, the addition of a little bit of grape juice, whether you cut some grapes and put them in your starter and you can remove them once your starter gets active, or just squeezing a little bit of the organic grape juice directly into your starter. Those methods can help get your starter get going faster. I've put a piece of apple before in my starter, and just the sugar and natural juices of the fruit will help get your starter going faster. I haven't added kombucha or kefir to my starter, but I have added kombucha to my bread ingredients, and that worked really well too. I've added maple syrup to a starter to get it bubbly faster because of the sugar. I think that's all I've ever tried, but honestly, to start, if you just use water and flour and feel those ingredients out, that would be a great way to start. And I would like to mention one more thing is, in some of my recipes, when I call them the quick sourdough, it's because at some point in the process, I add 1/4 teaspoon of commercial active yeast, and that just makes it go way faster. So instead of waiting like 7 days to create a starter, it actually can take only like 2 days, not a true wild yeast starter, but at the same time, you're using less active yeast, which you know, if you can't tolerate commercial yeast at all, then this is not an option for you. But for some, you know, if you're trying to do something quicker and you're just trying to find ways to bake a loaf of bread faster than taking 7 weeks and more. When I say quick sourdough, that's typically what I mean by it, as I'm adding 1/4 teaspoon of active dry yeast to my flour and water and whatever else I'm doing for that specific recipe. If we talk about containers, I pretty much always use glass jars when I'm doing a sourdough starter. Though I've seen people do it in plastic tin containers, but to me, I would prefer to avoid plastic, but that's just my opinion. As far as lids, I use coffee filters secured with an elastic band. I never weigh my flour. That's just, again, how I do things. I just go by scoop or by 1/4 cup, 1/2 cup, but I never weigh my ingredients. Not as of now anyways. And I don't check the temperature of my starters or my bread or my yeast or my loaves or my dough pretty much ever. So I don't use thermometers either. I think I've covered some of the most common questions I get asked, but if you can think of something else that I might not have answered, please ask me in the comments below and I will try to answer your question there. I will put all the notes below with a link to the recipe and a link to other videos that might be helpful. So I think that's it for now. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. But I tend to try to keep it. Oops. I can repeat that question.